So this book was probably the one that I really wanted to write the most my entire life. Right now it's currently out of print. We will be reissuing that hopefully later this year or the very beginning of next year. Believe you can find some copies on eBay because a lot of people like reselling them. Anyhow, it deals with the history of a small town in northeastern Vermont. And it is not a work of fiction, it is an historical book. And it is the town of Burke, Vermont. It is a town that I was born and brought up in. Also a town that my family helped settle back in the 1700s. It was settled before Vermont was even a state. We were an independent republic at the time. And after we became a state, the legislature made sure to verify and confirm all the charters that it had issued as an independent country. And everybody wants to know why I thought anybody would care about this book. No famous battles were fought there. No great scientists, explorers, discoverers, politicians, statesmen, or anything came from there. It's just a bunch of ordinary people. And I said, that's the point. It is ordinary people doing ordinary things and having extraordinary results. Picking up from a place that you have been familiar with all your life and going off someplace you have no idea what it's going to be like. There is nothing there. Literally nothing there. And rebuilding a home and a community. Now, in many of the cases of places in northern Vermont and northern New Hampshire, it wasn't just individual families moving. It would be members of a community picking up and going. So you quite often moved with your family, yes, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins, but you would also move with your neighbors, people that you had grown up with, people that you knew, liked, hopefully, and knew you could count on. And you'd be going off into the wilderness and starting over, dealing with weather, wild animals, disasters, famine, sickness, death, marriage, birth, all kinds of things. And I don't just talk about the settlers. I talk about their kids, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, all the generations that came after them that also grew up in this town, that were shaped by the decisions people years ago had made, that made decisions that would shape things further on. I talk about some friendly rivalries between various militia groups in town and how when they didn't have any adversary to face, they had to create one. The militias, the mustering, the attitudes of people, how they faced challenges, how they responded to the Civil War, how they responded to the aftermath of the Civil War, how they responded to the Underground Railroad, how they responded to the First World War, the Second, to Prohibition, Depression, women's suffrage, how the faith communities grew up and developed there, how the schools developed from little one-room schools to, a central elementary and middle school now. Did you know that maybe she isn't world famous like Madame Curie or Amelia Earhart or Helen Keller, but there was a young lady who came from the Burke schools, what's known as the Old White School in East Burke. It was a one-room schoolhouse, and she was much younger than a lot of the students. And back then, schooling was hit or miss. You had 2 sessions, the summer and the winter. The winter sessions were usually taught by men because that is when all the boys did not have to be working in the fields, and to keep them occupied, you sent them to school. So you had a school master then. And the schoolmaster taught what he knew. If you were able to get it and old enough to understand what he was talking about, good. If not, just hang by your thumbs and hope for the best. Well, Delia realized that this was a pretty crappy way of teaching children. So after she graduated from the schools and the normal schools, which were what they called teaching colleges then, she became one of the pioneers in age-appropriate education, targeting things for first graders that their minds can understand, not expecting them to be reading Horace or learning Latin or calculus, teaching them the alphabet, teaching them to read, teaching them to write, teaching them to count, add, subtract, multiply, and divide, things like that. And then with each grade, increasing their knowledge, increasing the curriculum. She also is considered one of America's first female geologists because she wrote a book in a typical style for back in the early 19th century of a type of a dialogue. Her character is a little girl who finds this, granite boulder in a field in Vermont, and she begins talking to it, and it talks, and it explains about geology and different types of rocks and how land forms and land masses and everything. And that is considered one of the first geological textbooks. And Julia Rufus Godding is considered one of the first female geologists. And she was home in East Burke, Vermont, which is the eastern village in the town of Burke, visiting her families in the 1840s. And she died unexpectedly, and she's buried in Woodmont Cemetery in East Burke, not far from the graves of my great-great-grandparents. There was another fellow, also a Woodruff, who was drafted into the Union Navy during the Civil War. He got a substitute for that because he wanted to go into the Army. And he went on to serve in many battles in the Civil War. He was wounded. He spent some time in Andersonville prison as a prisoner of war. He was discharged, re-enlisted, stayed on. He was part of the Columbia expedition after the war, surveying the Columbia River up through what's now the Pacific Northwest. He took part in some of the Indian Wars. He went on to become a brigadier general. His daughters went on to marry men who became generals. In fact, his son-in-law served as chief of staff for the United States Army for the president. And he was sandwiched in between General MacArthur and General George C. Marshall in the years just before the Second World War. Yes, it might not be as exceptional, say, as Boston. It might not be as influential as Washington, D.C. But if you want a good example of good, decent people trying to make a good, decent life for themselves, their children, and later generations, then reading In the Shadow of Old Burke Mountain is definitely worth it. And the book is broken down, this edition is broken down into 3 sections. One deals with the history, all from stories and accounts, and it's put together as a narrative, not like we had in school, endless recitation of dates and figures and people. It's their story. If you want a good story, that's what you need to read. The second part was kind of important because that is genealogies and biographies of the first families and influential families and some interesting people. Teachers and financiers and soldiers, veterans. And then there's another book that I think in the future I might issue separately. But a lot of the people, especially in the early years, New Englanders or Yankees are not widely known for expressing their emotions and their feelings. But they can be very, very sentimental. And so, how do you deal with that? Believe it or not, a lot of them wrote poetry. And in researching and finding old diaries and family Bibles and notes and cards and letters, I came across a bunch of poems. And I made sure that they didn't get lost. Some of the early settlers writing about their family history or personal tragedy or hopes and dreams. And then there was another woman. Her name was Myrtie Aldrich. She was born blind. She met Julia Ward Howe when she was a young girl, who encouraged her to write because she said, "You have a talent, you should really do this." And she did, sort of. And then later on, she met Helen Keller, who said, "No, my dear, you need to do this. You do have a talent." And so she would write poems, and she would have them published in local newspapers. And she became so popular that after the First World War, people wanted to raise money for the Red Cross and for wounded veterans and so on. So they asked her if they could collect all of her poems together in a booklet and sell it to raise money. They sold out. So I have some of her works in there. It's just really good, honest story about good, honest people. And hopefully it will inspire you to be a good, honest person.